recording. I'm also going to do my best to mute my microphone while you're talking so we don't have background noise. First question I've got for you.
I'm going to mute my phone real quick here. Hold on.
No, don't worry. I appreciate that. First question I've got for you. Can you say and spell your name for me and what I should put as your title?
I'm a professor at professor of law at Western Michigan Cooley Law School, and I think you have some information on my background already, correct? Okay.
Can you say and spell your name for me?
Yes, Lewis, Lewis, last name Langham, Langham.
Would it be appropriate to call you an expert on use of force?
I am quite familiar with the Michigan Coalition law enforcement standards on use of force, so I'm comfortable with addressing that along the way.
Wonderful. So we're here talking about the videos and the incident itself in the killing of Patrick Lyoya. From your perspective, I kind of want to walk through those videos and the incidents and everything that occurs within it. The beginning part, we see the police officer roll up in that first interaction. Is there anything that sticks out to you as against protocol or incorrect in the way that the officer behaved, or in any way of the actions that Patrick was taking that would justify an escalation?
Yeah, even looking at the subject control continuum and the standards that Grand Rapids uses, as well as IMCOs, the officer got out of his vehicle, gave a lawful police order to get back in your vehicle, and Mr. Lyoya didn't comply with that after being asked to return to his vehicle several times. So it was nothing inappropriate or wrong with what the officer did at that point.
And then after that, when we see Patrick walking or running, depending on whose definition you take, when we see him moving away from the officer and from his car, what do you make of that interaction in that moment?
Again, I'm not quite certain why Patrick decided to attempt to leave and walk away from the officer as well as his own vehicle, because he had not produced a driver's license or provided any type of documentation as to who he was, and he's driving a vehicle. So the officer had a right to attempt to detain him and possibly take him into custody, because at this point, we still don't know if he had a driver's license, and that's an arrestable offense.
So you talk about arrestable offense. Is that why we then see the officer attempt to put Patrick into some form of custody, whether it's handcuffs? We see that altercation start. Does this still seem within conduct standards?
He has reasonable suspicion, probable cause to detain Patrick Lyoya at that particular point, based upon the fact that the vehicle plates were improper and he refused to produce a driver's license, and he could actually arrest him for failure to provide that driver's license if he wanted to, and even tow his vehicle if necessary.
And then talking about the vehicle, we know there was a passenger in that car. We also know that another part of protocol is to focus on the car. If somebody is trying to flee, do you let them flee? What do you make of that?
Are you referring to Patrick attempting to flee?
Yes. So if we saw somebody else in the car and we know that he's either got to come back for the car, you said they could tow the car, whatever it might be. If someone is trying to flee a scene, is there a weight of, do we let them go? Do I chase them?
No, it's in this situation, this is not a vehicle actually moving. This is a person moving that was driving a vehicle that's not properly registered, and the officer not knowing what else may or may not be going on with this person or anything else. So it was very much appropriate for him to pursue Patrick as he was attempting to walk away from the officer and his vehicle.
And then when that scuffle begins, what do you make of that? We see the taser come out. We hear the officer say things like "stop resisting." Is this still complying with those guidelines that you see?
Yes, but you start out normally. What's supposed to happen? What normally happens, and when you get to this subject control continuum that police officers train with, your uniform presence, maybe that's enough. Your verbal command comes after that. Stop, get back in your vehicle. stop, return to your car. He refuses to return to his vehicle for some unknown reason at this particular point. The officer approaches him and explains to him why he stopped him. And again, he tells him to get back in his car. He refuses to get his driver's license. And he constantly asks the same questions over and over again. What did you stop me for, after it's already been answered? So the officer, I'm sure, is thinking, okay, what's going on here? What's happening here that he's not being compliant with reasonable lawful request?
And then if you'll give me just a moment, I have the video pulled up and I want to make sure I'm getting the timeline of it correct. So we see Patrick running away. We see them going to the ground. And then that's when we hear the taser coming out. Do you think that that also is within standards that's reasonable for what's happening in that situation?
That is reasonable for what's happening in that situation without question.
And then as we see that body camera get hit off, we see Patrick, or even before that, we see Patrick grabbing the taser.
Yes.
Does that, in your mind, take it from an escalation, even though we aren't sure if Patrick is armed or not? We know now that there wasn't, but when Patrick is grabbing that taser, do you believe that is another escalation to justify deadly force?
It is definitely an escalation, but taking the taser itself does not necessarily justify a police officer using deadly force at that particular time. Because even though the taser itself is not designed as a weapon to cause great bodily harm or even death, which are the two standards that a police officer has to use in order to fire his firearm. But if Patrick had gotten a hold of the taser, he could have incapacitated the police officer and maybe taken the officer's gun, and who knows what could have possibly happened after that.
So at that point, when we see that happening, when we see Patrick going for the taser, and we then see the body camera cut out, we do not know what happens to the body camera. And that's when we have to switch over to the other videos where we can see this entire scuffle that Patrick is on the ground. The officer is on top of him in that. Does that use of force, does that escalation, and then going and grabbing the gun in that moment, does that strike you as a justified escalation?
Well, it does escalate it even more than it already has. But the question which remains, which is what the Michigan State Police investigation is going to have to outline and establish as to, at the time the officer pulled that firearm and fired the one fatal shot that took the life of Patrick, was the officer justified at that particular moment firing his weapon? And that's where we're at as far to determine, actually, is there any legal liability for the officer at that particular point? Was he or was he not justified in firing his weapon based upon the totality of the circumstances and what was occurring at that moment? If you look at the video closely, and I know you have, Patrick is still kind of he's not necessarily on his stomach yet. He's face down and he's moving and he's on his knees and he's rolling in an attempt to throw the officer off of him. And the officer pulls out his weapon and he fires it. But at the moment he fires it, I'm not sure what's taking place in the officer's mind or what Patrick may or may not be saying at that particular time. But whatever caused the officer to fire, we're at that point right now. Everything up to that point, totally justifiable as far as the officer's actions. The question remains, at the time he pulled the trigger, would a reasonable police officer would have done the same thing under the circumstances, and whether or not it's considered justifiable. Those are the arguments that are going to be made by the prosecutors and in this particular case, in deciding whether or not to actually bring forth charges.
Obviously, you haven't been able to interview witnesses. You haven't been able to interview this officer purely off of seeing the video. Are you, at this point, willing to say one or another of what you believe is in that shot, in that moment of pulling the trigger, like you're saying? Do you believe that was a justified action?
Based upon what I saw in the video, it's really hard to determine. And the only reason I say that is because I noticed that there was one person on the lawn in the house next door, a neighbor or someone was outside watching this. Now, if Patrick had said something that would have led that officer to believe that maybe his life was in danger, I don't know the answer to that question. So if something was said by the officer or something was said by Patrick would possibly have great weight on whether or not the officer was justified or whether or not Patrick was reaching for anything else. I have no idea. So at this particular point, I'm going to have to wait for that last piece of interview information from the state police to interview the neighbor, watch the video, slow it down, and do everything they have to do and find out from questioning his officer, what do you think, officer? Why did you feel it necessary to fire your weapon at that particular time? And it's just obviously going to be a lot of circumstantial evidence that's going to come in, and it's going to be determined at that point. I can't. It's a tough call for the prosecution. I'll say that. It's not a slam dunk. Yes, guaranteed, we're going to charge this officer. That is not the case here. It's going to be close.
And then I want to ask you about, you talked about your experience with the use of force doctrine, essentially. We also have seen that training for GRPD officers for dealing with foreign nationals is something that is not required. Patrick Lyoya is a man who came over from Congo from the DRC 6 or 7 years ago. A language barrier is a very important factor in this. The optionality of that kind of training, how do you think that weighs into an officer's preparedness in that kind of situation?
Well, in this particular situation, and it's going to be determined about what Patrick understood. I don't know how long he's been in the United States. And I'm only can assume that when the officer asked Patrick, do you understand English? Do you understand what I'm saying? And Patrick says, yes, I understand. I can only take him at his word when he made that statement that there was not any misunderstanding or there wasn't a language barrier there.
And then one thing that we're hearing a lot from the family of Patrick Lyoya, from people who are demonstrating in the streets, is that this was a traffic stop. A traffic stop shouldn't be attributed with the death penalty, that sort of thing. Does the inciting incident, the prime thing, matter in the end, or does only everything that led up to it?
Okay, when I'll answer it this way, making sure I understand.
I can rephrase it if you need.
No, that's fine. And so you have to look at the totality of the circumstances, which basically means you have to start at the very beginning. It doesn't make any difference as long as there was a legal traffic stop that took place. All kinds of bad things can happen. Police officers around this country have stopped vehicles for traffic violations and have been shot and gunned down on the side of the road. All kinds of bad things happen. People take off in their cars, carjackings where little kids are in the back of the car. All kinds of things can happen from a traffic stop. Most police encounters happen from traffic stops, from the smallest amount of a traffic stop to the largest, and things go wrong sometimes. And so there's no issue there. I mean, there's a lot of questions, obviously. If the officer is actually charged by some reason in this particular case, everything is going to be on the table, and it's going to start at the very beginning. Was there a legal traffic stop? Why did Patrick refuse on several occasions to get back in his car? Why did he indicate he was going to get his driver's license and then turn and try to walk away? I'm sure that the officer is probably thinking, what's going on here? You know, what's going on? He's moving in a direction and he changes his mind. And is there something going on here the police officer, doesn't know about? So it's a lot of things going on as to why Patrick acted the way he did, and by refusing to follow lawful request, and why the police officer found it necessary to pull his firearm and shoot Patrick at the time he did. So those are the questions. We cannot start at the end. We have to start at the beginning and ask the questions from the very beginning: why Patrick did what he did, why he refused to cooperate, why he ran, why he wrestled, why he fought with the police officer, and why did the officer find it necessary to fire his weapon. And we can't start in the middle or at the end. We have to start at the beginning.
Watching through all of that, do you see anything that raises concern? Do you see any, we've seen other people call them red flags at parts of that video. Have you seen anything that you would label as that?
In what context, a red flag as it relates to?
For excessive use of force.
If there's any excessive use of force that's determined in this particular case after the state police investigation, it will only take place at one point, and that's when the officer fired his weapon. Up until that point, there was nothing that officer appeared to have done wrong.
Got it. I really appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything else that you want to add? I know we've gone through the video pretty thoroughly, but if there's anything I've forgotten to ask you about or anything that you think is important for context, I'd love to have that.
No, I think you've covered all the bases, and I just wanted to make sure that it was understood that, as I've already mentioned to you, that you have to take things at the very beginning. I understand that maybe it's not wanting to be talked about as to why Patrick did what he did. We're talking about why the officer did what he did, and that's important too. It obviously is important because he fired a shot and killed a person. But there's a bigger picture, and we need to analyze it and go through all of it.
And then I do want to tack this on. Patrick is a young Black man being pulled over by a white police officer. Obviously we cannot know what was going through his head, but do you think that some sort of fear of police could have preempted that flee, preempted him trying to run away because he was afraid?
I can only operate based upon what I've seen and what was shown on the videos. Patrick appeared to be calm throughout. His actions were resisting in a sense, verbally resisting and physically resisting, but there was nothing in Patrick's facial expressions or words that he used that indicate he was afraid of anything. He was very calm. He just didn't comply with the officer's actions.
Got it. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay.
I got to imagine we will be in touch again. I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording.